It was a crazy end to the conference championship playoff weekend with the Chiefs getting the win over the Bengals. And the Eagles will meet them in the Super Bowl. But before we talk about that here on the North Shore Drive podcast, we got to talk to our man Ray Fittipaldo because he's about to go to the Senior Bowl. And it's going to be a long week of looking at prospects who the Steelers could target going into the upcoming NFL draft. We'll talk about what that process is going to be like this week, then get into the playoffs, and then some Pens talk right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here, joined by Ray Fittipaldo on a Monday episode. As always, you could download this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and especially on YouTube. Watch this video on YouTube, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily episodes of content. We have this show Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but there's always content coming out from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette right here. Subscribe here, like this video if you enjoy it. Ray, we'll get into the playoffs and what we saw this weekend in a bit, but I think I wanted to spend some time sort of educating Steelers fans who might not be as up on the Senior Bowl and what this week's going to be like. You're going to be our man down there in Mobile, Alabama, getting to look at how things play out this week. Just a general consensus, if you could just describe what the environment's going to be like to Steelers fans, what's your biggest takeaway from the Senior Bowl?
Right. So even more so than the game on Saturday, I think there's a lot of evaluating by the coaches and the GMs and the scouts that takes place during the week. So each team will practice on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And, all of the front office types and the coaching staffs will be in attendance and watching all these guys practice. And then, of course, the game is the final piece of the evaluation. But, in addition to the Hula Bowl, which is, a smaller game, and East Shrine, another smaller type game, these are the best senior prospects in the draft. Now, there are underclassmen who are going to get drafted perhaps ahead of these guys, but these are the best seniors or redshirt juniors in this draft. So that's kind of a primer for the week. Lots of good prospects down there. And, of course, the Steelers and their fans will be interested. They got the picks of 17, 32, 49, and 80. In the upcoming draft, they got 4 picks in the top 3 rounds. So this is another big year for the Steelers down in Mobile.
Absolutely, and I believe cornerback coach Grady Brown's the defensive coordinator for one of the teams, so they'll get some firsthand experience with one of their position coaches being able to talk to some of these kids. And I also think it's important to point out, Ray, and you were talking about this a little bit, with the practices are sometimes more valuable as far as a learning perspective than the actual game. I think that's always interesting to see the reps that you guys get to see when you're down there live, and then get to see who's interacting with whom down there as the week goes on.
Yeah, I mean, much of the same way, think about a pro day. There will be offensive line coaches from designated NFL teams who will put, let's say, the players at Pitt through an offensive line drill. And they develop a program based on what the other scouts and the other teams want to see. And this will be very similar at the Senior Bowl. Grady Brown will have his plans on, how they're going to approach each practice. What individual drills do these GMs and coaches want to see? What kind of competition periods do these guys want to see? So, that's all part of it. This is really the first big step in the draft process, but you're going to have the combine too. You're going to have top 30 visits. These teams will get a chance to work out some of these guys individually as well on campus. But I think it's very good. It's a very good opportunity for these front offices to, sort of kick off the draft process and see these guys and the types of drills that they're going to be running here as pros in a couple of months.
Absolutely. And you'll be down there, you'll be gathering information, you'll be learning, you'll kind of be able to see some things close up. But just heading in, Can you give us just a couple names here and there who you think pique your interest as far as guys that the Steelers could look to for some to fill some of their positions of need?
Yeah. So first and foremost, this is a draft. It's really shaping up as a defensive draft. I think most of the top players in these mock drafts that fans will see on various websites loaded with edge rushers and
Mm,
loaded with cornerbacks in the first round. Daniel Jeremiah, the NFL Network, has 8 edge rushers and 6 corners going in his first round. So if you do the math on that, that's basically one half of the first round on those 2 positions. So not all those guys are going to be at the Senior Bowl. One of the big names who was going to be here was Illinois corner Devin Witherspoon. He opted out. He's pretty much entrenched as a top half of the first round guy. I think, the lowest he'll go is maybe 15 or 20, but I think he's probably going to be out of the Steelers range. Another cornerback named Tyreek Stevenson, probably a day 2 pick. Although Jeremiah had him at the end of his first round. So he's a guy to keep an eye on this week. And then if you talk about trench guys, DeJuan Jones from Ohio State. A lot of people talking about Paris Johnson. He's an underclassman who's going to come out. He's Ohio State's left tackle. DeJuan Jones played right tackle for Ohio State, and he's a day 2 guy. He's going to get drafted second or third round. I saw Jim Nagy, who's the executive director of the Senior Bowl, tweet last night. DeJuan Jones has the biggest wingspan ever at the Senior Bowl. He's got a wingspan of someone who's 7'5". So those are the types of things, the measurements that you're getting on guys for the first time, length for offensive tackles, all that stuff comes into play. So if the Steelers don't pull the trigger on a tackle in the first round, I'll be writing about some of the guys, possibly second round, third round, that they'll be keeping an eye on here down in Mobile.
Certainly, I think that's very much a possibility. I think there's a few guys there. There's also guys that if even if they don't go tackle, if they want to go in the interior line, there's going to be, I think, Osiris Torrance
Right.
from Florida. He's another guy that's going to be down there. But I think that's the key here. I think that people need to look at. Some of you might think, oh yeah, this guy's going to be great in the first round, but guys make their hay here, often go late first round, second round, anywhere in the second round, and possibly even third and fourth rounds. But guys, Christian Watson last year, he was kind of a name that people were intrigued by his build, but it was what he did at the Senior Bowl that made him a second round pick for the Packers. It's going to be interesting to see who got what guys step up here. And that's again why it's like we're just giving a preliminary look at here, not a commitment on who definitely is going to be the guy the Steelers need to just target the whole week.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the Steelers have taken, and this was under Kevin Colbert, so new regime, so keep that in mind. They've drafted 6 players who have taken part in the Senior Bowl over the last 2 years. People always look at, okay, first rounders, Najee Harris a couple years ago, Kenny Pickett last year, of course, but Dan Moore Jr. was a Senior Bowl participant back in, I guess it would have been 2021. Trey Norwood as well. So they're able to, identify guys in the deeper rounds or undrafted free agents too. So that's another aspect of this process. It's just not all the big hype guys you're going to be hearing about over the next couple of months. There are going to be guys, like you said, middle rounds, late rounds, that the Steelers will be down here scouting as well.
Absolutely. One of those guys also could be Pitt's own Servassier Dennis. He's the lone Pitt Panther who's down here for the start of the week. Though I do want to remind people, sometimes late invites happen. Jimmy Morrissey was a beneficiary of that years ago for Pitt. There was an injury that happened that allowed him to get a late invite, came in, got some reps, and ended up being a late round draft pick because of it. So not something that always happens, but something to keep on the mind. But Servassier Dennis will be the Pitt player to watch if anyone's out there. And who knows? Maybe the Steelers could use an off-ball linebacker in the later rounds, looking at this draft. But I want to get Ray's thoughts on the playoffs because that was the action that we saw there before he heads down to Mobile. We'll get Ray's thoughts on that in a minute here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. But first, we got to talk to you about our great sponsors at Valley Pool and Spa. The snow is here and there. It's that time of the year where you're starting to, where you're not sure if it's going to be ice cold or if it's just going to be kind of chilly. But the best place to kind of deal with that is in your own house. When you're enjoying one of your swim spas or your hot tubs or your saunas that you bought from Valley Pool and Spa. You can relax and soak in a hot tub or a swim spa from Valley Pool and Spa right in your own home. And the best place to go do that and find all the different saunas and spas available is right there at Valley Pool and Spa. They have a Finleo sauna that's going to help melt your stress away, relax, feel awesome at home, and feel refreshed when you go out to attack your day. So go to Valley Pool and Spa right now to save big on all in-stock hot tubs, swim spas, and saunas at valleypoolspa.com. That's valleypoolspa.com. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We're all here talking things. Ray, let's take a step back from the Steelers and the Senior Bowl for a minute, and let's look at what happened in these playoff games. Now, on the NFC side, it's pretty much obvious just what happened there. The Eagles were an obvious favorite going into the game, and then that even increased by a lot more when Brock Purdy got hurt early on. And the Niners, I thought they did a good job hanging in there in the first half, keeping it close for a little bit. But then eventually the Eagles, they were just the team that they've been all season. They will punish you if you do not capitalize on any mistakes or you don't make some plays of your own. And eventually it was just too much for the Niners to handle.
Yeah, Chris. I mean, if you look at Philadelphia's 2 playoff games and, the number 1 seeds for the second year in a row, the only teams that get buys. So 2 playoff opponents, 88 carries, 416 yards.
Jeez.
Jalen Hurts did not throw for more than 154 yards in the playoffs so far. Threw for $121 yesterday in that win yesterday. So that's their formula on defense. They get after quarterbacks. People keep saying you got to run the ball against Philly. That's their weakness. Teams don't do it. San Francisco, perhaps the best or one of the best running teams in the NFL, and they didn't get a chance to do that yesterday. A lot because of the quarterback situation. But if San Francisco can't do it, can't establish it, then I don't know who's going to be able to do that. Certainly not the Chiefs. Mahomes is going to be dropping back and passing in the Super Bowl in a couple of weeks. So, the Eagles just bludgeon you in the trenches on both sides. That's the way that team was built. And pay attention, Steelers fans. Andy Weidel helped build that Eagles team. He put together the draft boards for the past 3 years for the Eagles. He's now the assistant GM, the top personnel man under Omar Khan with the Steelers. So a lot of speculation that he's going to address the trenches for the Steelers. I wouldn't be surprised if he does here this offseason.
To your point, they beat the Giants 38-7. They beat the Niners 31-7, and now they get to face a Chiefs team that I think they had a spirited fought, but I think you're right. They're going to have to bring it, and that was the Niners' vaunted run defense that they ripped apart and had 4 rushing touchdowns on. They now, with that, they now have the most rushing touchdowns combined in the regular season and playoffs in NFL history. It was a record that football-wise stood since 1924 for a team from Frankfurt. So you're absolutely right. The Eagles setting a tone for what I think the Steelers are trying to get to in the next couple of years. But 2 teams that had the major quarterbacks that everyone was talking about going into this game, going into this weekend, were the Bengals with Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes with the Kansas City Chiefs. And it was a great game. It was a lot better of a game than what we saw on the other side with a 31-7 beatdown. But the Chiefs finding a way to edge things out there. I thought it was really spirited effort there, Ray, from Patrick Mahomes with the way that he threw some really tough passes. He hung in the pocket. And then in the end, with the scramble that he had to keep that drive alive, penalties aside with the push out of bounds this side, I thought he showed exactly why people call him the best in the league with that game.
Yeah, I mean, just a terrific performance by Mahomes. He wasn't 100%, but he battled. The Bengals didn't get off to a good start, Chris, and I thought that really set the stage for the Chiefs to just sort of, get a lead in that game. Okay, put some doubt in the minds of the Bengals that they could get it done. The Bengals just ripped apart the Bills early, jumped on top, and that was no contest. That did not happen yesterday. So I thought the Chiefs defense really stepped up. Usually it's the Chiefs offense we're always talking about. How about the number of rookies, especially in the secondary?
I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, for the Chiefs. I mean, just really impressive stuff by Steve Spagnuolo. I don't know if it's going to be enough to beat the Eagles. We'll see. I do find it interesting that we have sort of one team, the Chiefs from the modern era, and then we kind of have the Eagles, like a turn back the clock type of team,
Right.
Defense and run the ball. Kind of a fascinating Super Bowl from that perspective. So I can't wait. It'll be hopefully a great game in a couple of weeks, but kind of contrasting styles there, if you ask me.
No, I agree. And this is something that I think I've been talking about as far as playing into something I think Steelers fans should watch just to see how it plays out, because you had teams in the NFC and AFC championship games, you had completely different styles of offenses. The Bengals pass first, load up the wide receiver core, let Joe Burrow air it out. Even though they do play, their wins have come because Joe Mixon has run well and the defense has played well, which I think will be very interesting for how that team might have to retool itself this offseason, because they have some questions that they're going to have to answer it with free agency, and they have money to spend now, but they can't afford to lock themselves too much into the wrong guys, because Joe Burrow's contract renewal will be coming in a couple years. So that's going to be interesting on the side. But you're absolutely right about the Eagles, and then the Eagles, the way that they play the style of ball the Steelers, I think, are trying to get to, as do the Niners, and as do a few other teams in the NFL. And I think it's going to be very interesting, the style contrast, how that plays out in this upcoming Super Bowl that we're going to see in 2 weeks. But another thing you pointed out, I think that the Chiefs deserve a ton of commendations for how they played in this game. You had, especially on defense, like you talked about, there was the play where they intercepted Joe Burrow in the fourth quarter. Was they double teamed T. Higgins on a deep ball. It was a rookie who tipped the ball and a rookie who intercepted the ball. And Trent McDuffie, another rookie himself, he got beat a couple times early, but there were some really big plays that he made. I thought it was very resilient. You saw the effort from that Chiefs team to bounce back because I said this all game long, when the Chiefs came out and they were getting the stops early but only getting field goals, I was like, that could come back to bite you. And eventually the Bengals, they came roaring out, but you saw that Chiefs defense, they didn't flinch, they didn't crumble, they kept making stands. I thought that was very promising. I do think that's going to make this Super Bowl very interesting for me, at least. We got to see how healthy the Chiefs are, because Patrick Mahomes, even though he had a great game, he's definitely not 100%. They were down to three wide receivers by the end of that game. They got to see how healthy those guys can get. But I think the way that they adjusted to how the Bengals played was phenomenal. I wonder if Andy Reid and Spagnuolo and that coaching staff have something in store that can battle with what the Eagles do.
Yeah, I mean, listen, Snead goes out early, first or second series.
Yep.
They got to put backups in. I mean, the reason, those guys played great. Secondary played great. They got 2 interceptions of Burrow, but Chris Jones is the man. I mean, that guy is a really good football player. The other Chiefs on that front got after it too. So it's always the case, when the secondary makes plays, there's usually pressure up front. So that, Chris Jones is the Chiefs' best defensive player. He showed up Sunday, and I thought that really helped that young Chiefs secondary come through and make some plays.
Absolutely. We'll be talking about how that plays out when that does. But until then, follow my man Ray Fittipaldo and all the great work that he does. He's going to be in Mobile. He's leaving a little bit after that. A little bit after we record this, we'll get some more insight from him once he's down there, because I want to hear some of the insights that Ray has. But if you want to read his work, only at the post at post-gazette.com. Thanks so much, Ray. We'll see you again soon. We'll be switching topics in a bit here in a minute. But first, we got to talk to you guys about Yinzers in the Berg. Hey, Pittsburgh sports fans, if you need gear, the best place to go is Yinzers in the Berg. They've got their 2 stores in the Strip District that you can go to anytime to get all the Pittsburgh sports apparel, accessories, and anything you could think Pittsburgh sports. And if you can't get there, just go to their website, YinzersPGH.com. At YinzersPGH.com, they have new merchandise updating every week to get you new gear, whether you're a Steelers fan, Pirates fan, Penguins fan, Pitt fan, whatever thing you got Pittsburgh sports, they've got there. So go to Yinzers in the Berg or check them out online at YinzersPGH.com. That's YinzersPGH.com for all your Pittsburgh sports apparel. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter here, your host. We're switching now. We had our man Ray Fittipaldo talking Senior Bowl and NFL playoffs, and now we've got our man Andrew Destin, who's out there in Wilkes-Barre, covering the baby Penguins. But we got to talk about the main Penguins, Andrew, because that was a disturbing loss that we saw to the San Jose Sharks on Saturday, and I think it left a lot of people reeling about where the Penguins are. And you saw some uncharacteristic things there, especially like on the game losing goal that they gave up. You see Sidney Crosby skating along the side, not engaging in the way that people expect him to in a lot of those big moments. And San Jose, they're a lottery team. Like they're a team that's looking to try to, they're in the running to have the number one overall lottery pick this year. And you can't afford to lose to those types of teams when you're struggling to be in the playoff hunt right now. What went wrong there for the Penguins, and is this even more of a bad sign for what's coming in the second half of the season?
I think the better question is what went right, because you can make the argument this was the worst game or the second worst game of the season for the Penguins. Another one that comes to mind is when they blew a 4-0 lead after the first period against the Detroit Red Wings right after the Christmas break. Have your choice, whichever one of those two. This was a horrendous performance from the Penguins. Especially, like you said, against a team like the Sharks that they're trying to lose. I mean, that's pretty much the active point there. And you were facing a backup goaltender for San Jose on the second night of a back-to-back road series for the Sharks. They had played in Carolina the night before and lost in overtime. So everything about this game screamed must win for Pittsburgh, and they, came up short in that one. And heading into the All-Star break, I mean, it's a 9-day layoff where the Penguins really do need to rest up and refine themselves because they are clinging to that 8th place spot. And I don't think we should expect to see more of these kinds of, failures from the Penguins in the sense of losing to doormat franchises, like the Sharks are right now in the Western Conference. But there were a lot of issues that have kind of, like you said, plagued the Penguins all year long. Careless defense in their own zone, untimely goaltending. Casey DeSmith wasn't able to bail the team out when they kind of needed him to. And on the offensive end, they were successful on the power play. But if you look at the 5-on-5 game, the Sharks kind of took it to the Penguins. So those are all things that have been constant all year long, is that when the power play is firing, the Penguins do well. When it's not, leave something to be desired because the 5-on-5 game isn't quite where it needs to be. And then the penalty kill, for the most part, has been good for the Penguins. But, of course, you'd like to see a little bit better there. And just not be so special teams dependent, because that's what it feels like it is for this team right now, which maybe that's to be expected with an older franchise, one of the older teams in hockey, that when you shrink the game to just a third of the sheet of ice, make it a little bit easier on yourself. But still, being so special teams dependent, they still got 2 goals out of it against the Sharks, and that wasn't enough.
Yeah, I think that's a rough part of this situation here. And now you're sitting there at 57 points in the standings. And, we were talking about earlier when they beat the Panthers, it was a good sign that, okay, they can, they can separate themselves. But right behind them, Buffalo at 56 points, the Islanders at 55 points, and the Panthers at 54 points. This is shaping up to be a close thing. And I think it's also interesting, to see the points differential goals differential on their situation right now. You look at all the other 7 teams that, are ranked ahead of them in the Eastern Conference standing right now. All of them are in double digits in goals difference on the year from allowed to scored. The Penguins are only +8 on the season. Even Buffalo is +20, and they're behind them in the standings right now. It makes me wonder, Andrew, if part of this has been that this kind of, you and I talked about this just last week about how, with Letang and him coming back and the things, and there's been things in the way of this team playing consistently together, but also this is a vet team that's supposed to understand how to do that without as much catch-up time as, say, teams that are banking on a lot of new players, first, second, third-year players, on their roster. I think it's more concern that we're looking at here that maybe the Penguins are actually in trouble of losing the longest playoff streak in sports history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really signals with an older franchise, when you look at this roster and who's logging a lot of the minutes. I mean, the guys who have played in every game this season, it's your Malkins, it's your Crosby, it's Brian Dumoulin. I mean, these are names that we've heard for many years in Pittsburgh, and the thought of tired legs has to come to mind. And you couldn't really have asked, I think, for a better time for the All-Star break if you're the Penguins, with, like we mentioned before, guys who are coming back that they're desperately needing back into the lineup. It can't hurt. You have to believe that after the All-Star break, more than likely Tristan Jarry will be back ready to go, and that's certainly a big thing. Jan Ruda, who's been a steadying presence on that blue line. It helps to get those guys back, but there's something to be said about, after 49 games, maybe these guys just needed some time off. And it feels simplistic, but I think it really goes to the point that if these guys, this veteran core, isn't ready for that stretch drive of the next 33 games right out the gate, then they're going to lose this eight seed really quickly. And it's going to be hard to make up ground when you've essentially been riding a couple of really hot streaks, one at the beginning of December and one at the very beginning of the season, that have essentially carried your team through a lot of mediocre to less than play through the rest of the regular season. It's 2 hot streaks and a lot of nothing else really from the Penguins, and you can point to those special teams as reasons for those hot streaks, as well as some really great goaltending performances from Tristan Jarry. And you don't have him right now, at least for the foreseeable future. Whenever he returns, that's huge, but for the time being, this team is lacking in a lot of different areas, and coming out of that All-Star break, they really will need to be hitting it from the get-go. Otherwise, we could be talking, Chris, about that long playoff streak coming to an end.
It's crazy to think about that, and the efforts that the Penguins front office made to keep this crew together. The last thing here for you, Andrew, if there's one thing that you can cling to right now that a turnaround could happen, that a solid second half push, whether it is the front office or players on the team or Tristan Jarry being healthy, what is the biggest thing you're holding on to right now to see like, hey, I do think the Penguins can do this, and that could be what pushes them up in the standings just enough to protect their spot?
Yeah, you said it right there. It's Jarry. They need him to go on another one of those heater stretches like he had in December. I mean, Penguins fans know that he's more than capable of a month-long extended of really excellent hockey that kind of propels the team. And for the rest of that, he's a solid, not spectacular goaltender. If they can get him back at full strength and not get hurt for the 3rd time this year, he's already had 2 stretches now, including in the current one where he's missed some time. Once he returns, I mean, the stats speak for themselves of his mark at 1 point, 16, 5, and 5. This is a guy who, when at his best, is probably a top 10 goaltender in the NHL. Getting him back instead of Casey DeSmith as your number 1, who this year has really struggled when being elevated from a backup to a starting role. That's another cause for concern, because if Jarry doesn't come back, my expectations of the Penguins making the playoffs will go much lower. But if there's anything to hang your head on, it's, if Jarry can come back and be healthy and be the goalie that he was for the majority of this season, then you're probably okay if you're the Penguins. But that's a lot to ask for, and you're kind of banking on one player, which is not where you want to be for a roster of over 20.
I hear that. We'll see if they can make those adjustments. Like you said, they got a week off, time to get healthy, get through this break. But I do think you're right. We're going to need to see some hot streaks from this team to kind of pull their weight. But we've seen Crosby, Malkin, and that crew do it before, granted, when they were younger. So it's going to be interesting to see how they make that push. Andrew, thanks so much for your great coverage. Follow him like you follow all of us at Post-Gazette.com and all the work we do here on Everything Pittsburgh Sports. Thanks again for checking out the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We thank both Andrew and our earlier guest, Ray Fittipaldo, on their coverage on the Steelers and the Penguins. We'll have another episode Wednesday, but don't miss Noah Hiles and I. We have our Pit mailbag coming out on Tuesday on this same channel. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and especially YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, like the video, subscribe to this channel for all of our daily content from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. This show will be back Wednesday talking all things Pittsburgh sports. Should be a fun one. We will see you then.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down below in the description.